Welcome back to my tutorial. Welcome back to my tutorial, Cultural Dimensions of Spain and Their Application in the Spanish Job Market. Moving forward from power distance, the next cultural dimension we will be discussing is individualism versus collectivism. This is whether a culture tends to think and act in terms of individuality or in a collective and group-oriented way. Individualistic cultures like the US place strong emphasis on individual and personal growth. Individual benefit supersedes the best interests of the group. They are focused on independent achievement, and these cultures expect that more business and personal decisions will be in context to what is best for the bottom line. Individualistic cultures exist in regions where homes are comprised of immediate family, where one is encouraged through upbringing to develop an individual personal identity. These cultures tend to have loose ties between members of social networks since they tend to think in terms of ever-changing personal interests and decisions. On the other hand, collectivist cultures place strong emphasis on what is in the best interests of their collectivist group, and their decision-making is based on keeping their personal ties healthy. Collectivist cultures exist in regions where homes are comprised of extended family, where one is encouraged to maintain constant loyalty to their group in exchange for the unquestioned loyalty from it. For this reason, collectivist cultures tend to hold close-knit and long-lasting social networks. Like all of the other cultural dimensions, these patterns of thought aren't necessarily acted upon consciously. It is thought of as being hardwired into the perception and thought pattern of the persons in the group, and are extremely deep-rooted into one's mind. As you can see, there is a significant difference between Spain and the US in respect to individualism versus collectivism. Spain's individualism index shows that Spanish culture tends to fall at 58%, meaning that this culture is relatively balanced between building personal growth and maintaining loyalty to the group. On the other hand, the United States, one of the most individualistic cultures, falls at 90% on the index. With that in mind, here's a critical thinking question. Cultures that are individualistic tend to also be low context, and to the contrary, collectivist cultures tend to be high context. Why do you think this is? It is said that individualistic cultures tend to be low context because since they are constantly making and breaking social ties, there is less presence of shared internalized information and more need to verbally code messages through low context communication. And vice versa for collectivist cultures. They maintain social networks, share more internalized information, and thus are able to use communication and understand one another through the use of high context communication. The next cultural dimension we will be discussing is assertiveness versus modesty. It is also referred to as masculinity versus femininity, but since this implies an unnecessary emphasis on gender, I prefer to explain it by its first title. Assertiveness, in terms of the cultural dimension, is a culture's tendency to interact outwardly and aggressively, to speak their minds freely and boldly seek the things that they want. Modesty, to the contrary, is a culture's tendency to remain focused on maintaining well-mannered communication and abstain from boastfulness or overly aggressive pursuit of their wants. I feel this is one of the most important cultural dimensions to account for while working between cultures, and especially during the job interview process, since first impressions are so important and violating a culture's norm of assertiveness or modesty is an easy way to offend them or be dismissed by them. The example that I read about during the course of my research was about a Dutch engineer that was interviewing for a job in the US. This engineer was extremely well qualified for the position, but since his culture's tendency was to maintain a high degree of modesty and not to spout off any accomplishments until specifically asked about them, he appeared to the American interviewer to be very underqualified and did not receive the position, since the American interviewer was accustomed to much more assertive communication and thought that since the Dutch man didn't state his accomplishments, he must not have many. The Dutch engineer said that he didn't realize what he had done wrong in this interview until much later. When he was in the position to hire employees, he noticed that all of the American employees he interviewed were not embarrassed and did not find it rude to highlight their qualifications, whether they were asked about them or not. With this example in mind, it is easy to see how being underprepared to compensate for cultural differences can greatly affect business success. The breakdown for assertiveness has Spain ranking at just about 40% and the US at just about 60%, which means that the US tends to be aggressive in the communication style over 20% more than that of Spain. So here's your interview scenario to apply the concept of assertiveness versus modesty. Considering that Spain has a much greater cultural tendency toward modesty than assertiveness, what do you think is an appropriate way to conduct yourself in a job interview? A. To spell out all of your achievements and transferable skills whenever you find an opportunity. Or B. Wait to be asked questions to which you can respond in a way that highlights your achievements and transferable skills. The correct answer is B. Given Spain's tendency toward modesty, it would come off as arrogant or rude to overly emphasize why you are such a qualified applicant. It is said in Spain that a good product sells itself. It is almost worse to oversell yourself or an idea because it will cause skepticism as to why you're putting so much effort into selling something when they can obviously tell a quality product through their own judgment. The next concept that we will be discussing is avoidance of uncertainty. Avoidance of uncertainty is a society's tolerance for uncertainty, ambiguity, or lack of structure. Cultures characterized by high avoidance of uncertainty tend to have strict laws and rules, as well as many safety and security measures. They tend to form religion around one absolute truth because for there to be more than one spiritual possibility would be ambiguous and frustrating. And it is also noted that people with cultures high in uncertainty avoidance also tend to be more outward with showing emotions and are motivated by nervous energy. Cultures low in avoidance of uncertainty tend to be open to new and unknown situations, create as few rules as possible to avoid being limited by one set of possible outcomes, open to different opinions and thus less outward with emotions, since new and uncertain situations are not as unappealing to them and aren't seen as a call to action. And it is noted that people within these cultures tend to be more contemplative in decision making. As you can see, this culture dimension has the largest disparity between Western and Spanish cultural tendencies. The US is much more open to uncertainty and ambiguity at 46%, which is just about the average, whereas Spain is very intolerant of uncertainty. Though Spaniards tend to handle scheduling appointments and these types of things loosely, this culture demands structure in other areas such as laws and business deals. It can be expected that in any deal with a Spanish company, they will make sure to tie as many loose ends as possible and expect answers and logic in the answers given to their questions about specific details and so on. With this in mind, here's your interview question. What is your opinion on maintaining firm structure and routine in personal and career development? Which of the following responses do you feel a Spanish interviewer would most prefer to hear? A. It is important to a degree, but I feel that being flexible and incorporating change is of key importance. It is not necessary. A successful person greets frequent change and innovation. To adapt is to survive, and permanent structure hinders adaptation. C. It is very important. Adhering to structure and working under consistent and well-planned circumstances is key to eliminating the uncertain and being able to successfully conduct business. Or D. None of the above. These all sound like adequate enough answers to an interview question, but the best response would be C. It would show that you are on the same page as them and can fit within their cultural expectations and comforts. It goes without question that nonverbal communication is one of the most important and also one of the most difficult things to adapt to when working interculturally. Facial expressions. Of all the facial expressions, the one with the most interpretation is the smile. In Western culture, smiling is a way to appear open and friendly, but to many other cultures, they perceive it as constant smiling being a cold and put on gesture. In Japan, people do not smile in public because they feel it is a way of forcing one's emotions onto another person. Germans do not smile frequently either, but not for the same reason as the Japanese. Germans are prone to believing that the world is not always an enjoyable place, so they feel that frequent smiling is unnecessary. East Asia also uses smiling differently than Americans. They smile most frequently as a means of showing embarrassment instead of showing that they are pleased. Of all the different uses for smiles among cultures, the culture that differs most greatly with the US is Korea. Koreans feel that smiling at a stranger is something that only children or mentally challenged individuals do. With that being said, there is no question that it is of the utmost importance to understand different cultures' use of facial expressions to avoid making someone uncomfortable or giving them the wrong impression. Fortunately for Western Americans working within Spain, this aspect of nonverbal communication is roughly the same. The extent to which people are comfortable touching or being touched by someone that they are communicating with varies greatly and can be one of the easiest ways to make cross cultural communication uncomfortable. The difference between Western culture and Spanish culture in this nonverbal form of communication is that those of Spanish culture tend to make much more contact while communicating, even with strangers. It is a custom in Spain to greet a new acquaintance or someone you are just meeting with two kisses, one on each cheek. Silence. Since the cycle of communicating consists of encoding a message, decoding a message, sending a message, and sending feedback, it is very obvious why silence is important. The concept of silence among different cultures is an easier one to define with this one simple generalization. If a culture is high context, they will tend to be more comfortable with bouts of silence, and if a culture is low context, they will tend to feel the need to fill every moment with words. Since low context cultures depend on verbalized messages to communicate, silence is seen as being uncomfortable. For this reason, silence is quickly perceived in many different ways. It can show that the receiver of a message has not heard the sender, is angry at the message, that something is wrong, or that one needs time to think. In high context cultures, where communication is much more internalized, silence can be seen as preferred over conversation. The tricky part of using silence in communication is when you're using it mid conversation to cue when one person is finished talking and the other may begin. In the US, it is customary for a person to stop talking and then right after the other person begins, in an almost seamless transition. In Spain, the norm is that two people communicating will tend to overlap on one another, beginning to speak just before they think the other person is going to finish speaking. It is difficult for any culture to alter and adapt this behavior to a new culture since it is so hardwired into their brain, but if both are aware of the difference, it will make it much easier for one culture to understand the other and not be offended. Eye contact. Eye contact is frequently used to show ranking in a hierarchy. Bosses feel they are entitled to look their employees in the eye, and employees will often avert their gaze to show their acceptance of their role as a subordinate. Eye contact is one of the most difficult behaviors as far as cross cultural communication is concerned, because it is something that is so deeply rooted in one's subconscious that it is very difficult to monitor. This is problematic because eye contact has extremely different implications depending on culture. Some cultures believe it is important to maintain intense eye contact to appear trustworthy, where others see intense staring as an invasion of privacy. This makes it easy for miscommunications to occur. For example, a person of one culture may be communicating and want to avert their gaze out of respect, whereas someone of a different culture may expect this person to maintain that eye contact to prove that they are being trustworthy. Spain and the US are near enough in terms of this non-verbal communication that it will not pose a problem, but it is noteworthy that Spanish people tend to hold their gaze slightly longer than Americans do. As an extra pointer for applying for jobs in Spain, it is customary to use a curriculum vitae or CV instead of a resume, as is customary in the United States. There aren't many drastic differences to note between the two that can't easily be accounted for with a little bit of personal research, but a couple things to remember are that it is common to provide a picture on a Spanish CV, and it is also common to provide some background personal information, such as marital status. Here is a quick reference of the top 10 companies in Spain that you may find yourself wanting to apply for in the future. So, by properly applying what you have learned here today in the Spanish job market and workforce, maybe one day this could be you. Muchas gracias.